There are many fascinating old tales of mischief and misdoings across the diggings of the Victorian goldfields. One such tale was shared around the Mount Alexander diggings in the early 1850s and has all the typical makings of a good story: love, rivalry, treacherous deceit, and a humorous triumph over adversity. James Bonwick referred very briefly to this interesting incident in his 1852 book, Notes of a Gold Digger and Gold Digger's Guide. Bonwick wrote, "A policeman one day demanded a sight of his license from a digger at Friars Creek. The man civilly said it was in his waistcoat down the hole and that he would go and fetch it directly. He departed and forgot to return. The hole was visited, but the bird had flown. As it happened, there was much tunnelling in that part, and the man had quietly passed along the subterranean passages and raised his head from another and distant cell." Ellen Clacy related a much more detailed and spirited narrative of the incident in her book, A Lady's Visit to the Gold Diggings of Australia in 1852-53. Her account is quite entertaining, so I'll share it with you here. Mike and Robert were two as good mates as any at the Mount Alexander diggings. They had a good spell of hard work and, as is usually the way, returned to Melbourne for a holiday at Christmas time. And then it was that the bright eyes of Susan Hinton first sowed discord between them. Mike was the successful wooer, and the old man gave his consent, for Mike, with one exception, had contrived to make himself a favourite with both father and daughter. The exception was this: old Hinton was a strict disciplinarian, one of what is called the good old school. He hated radicals, revolutionists and reformers, or any opposition to church or state. Mike, on the contrary, loved nothing better than to hold forth against the powers that be, and it was his greatest boast that the government had never pocketed a farthing from him in the way of a licence. This, in the old man's eyes, was his solitary fault, and when Mike declared his intention of taking another trip to the lottery fields before taking a ticket in the even greater lottery of marriage, he solemnly declared that no daughter of his should ever marry a man who had been openly convicted of in any way evading the licence fee. This declaration from any other man who had already promised his daughter in marriage would not have had much weight. But Mike knew the stern, strict character of Hinton and respected this determination accordingly. The day of their departure arrived, and with a tearful injunction to bear in mind her father's wishes, Susan bade her lover farewell, and Robert and he proceeded on their journey. Full of his own happiness, Mike had never suspected his comrade's love for Susan, and little dreamt he of the hatred against himself to which it had given birth, hatred the more to be dreaded since it was concealed under a most friendly exterior. For the first month, Mike behaved to the very letter of the law, and having for the sum of £1 10 purchased his legal right to dig for gold, felt himself a most exemplary character. Success again crowned their efforts, and a speedy return to Melbourne was contemplated. In the ardour of this exciting work, another month commenced, and Mike at first forgot and then neglected to renew his licence. The inspector rarely came his rounds before the 14th. The neighbourhood was considered deserted, fairly worked out. He'd never come round there. Thus argued Mike, and his friend cordially agreed with him. Lose a day's work standing outside the Commissioner's tent, broiling in a crowd when 2 days would finish the job? Not he, indeed. Mike might please himself, but he shouldn't get a licence, and this determination on the part of his mates settled the matter. In one respect, Mike's self-security was not unfounded. The gully in which their tent was now pitched was nearly deserted. Some while previous, there had been a great rush to the place, so great that it was almost excavated. Then the rush took a different direction, and few now cared to work on the 2 or 3 spots that have been left untouched. Like many other localities considered worked out, as much remained in the ground as had been taken from it, and as each day added to their store, Mike's hilarity increased. It was now the 10th of the month. Their hole had been fairly bottomed, a nice little nest of nuggets discovered, their gains divided, and the gold sent down to the escort office for transit to Melbourne. A few buckets full of good washing stuff was all that was left undone. Today we'll finish that, thought Mike, and to it he set with a hearty goodwill, to the intense satisfaction of his comrade, who sat watching him at a little distance. Suddenly Mike felt a heavy hand upon his shoulder. He looked up and saw before him the inspector. He had already with him a large body of defaulters, and Mike little doubted but that he must be added to their number. Old Hinton's determined speech, Susan's parting words and tears, flashed across his mind. "You've lost your bonny bride," muttered Robert, loud enough to reach his rival's ears. Mike glanced at him, and the look of triumph he saw there roused every spark of energy within him, and it was in a tone of well-assumed composure that he replied to the inspector, "My license is in my pocket and my coat is below there," and without a moment's hesitation sprang into his hole to fetch it. Some minutes elapsed. The inspector waxed impatient. A suspicion of the truth flashed across Robert's mind, and he too descended the hole. There was the coat and the license of the past month in the pocket, but the owner had gone, vanished, and an excavation on one side which led into the next hole, and thence into a complete labyrinth underground, plainly pointed out the method of escape. Seeing no use in ferreting the delinquent out of so dangerous a place, the inspector sulkily withdrew, though not without venting some of his ill humour upon Robert, at whose representations made to him the day previous he had come so far out of his road. But let us return to Mike. By a happy thought, he had suddenly remembered that whilst working some days before in the hole, his pick had let in daylight on one side, and the desperate hope presented itself to his mind that he might make a passage into the next pit, which he knew led into others, and thus escape. His success was beyond his expectation, and he regained the open air at a sufficient distance from his late quarters to escape observation. Once able to reflect calmly upon the event of the morning, it required little discrimination to fix upon Robert his real share in it. And now there was no time to lose in returning to Melbourne and prevent, by a speedy marriage, any further attempt to set his intended father-in-law against him. The roads were dry, for it was the sultry month of February, and 2 days saw him beside his lady love. Although railroads are as yet unknown in Australia, everything goes on at railroad speed, and a marriage concocted one day is frequently solemnised the next. His eagerness, therefore, was no way remarkable. No time was lost, and when, 3 days after Mike's return, Robert, with his head full of plots and machinations, presented himself at old Hinton's door, he found them all at a well-spread wedding breakfast, round which were gathered a merry party, listening with a digger's interest to the way in which the happy bridegroom had evaded the inspector. Mike had wisely kept the story till Susan was his wife. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. Englishwoman Ellen Clacy travelled to the goldfields of Victoria with her brother in 1852. She published a brilliant book which details her journey from Melbourne to the diggings and includes accounts and observations of the road to the diggings, the towns, the countryside, the people they met, the stories they heard, and the nature of the goldfields and the work they did on the diggings. Told in a light-hearted manner but packed with lots of serious content, this book is a pleasure to read and is available to read online in its entirety. I'll put a link in the description below. Thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in the fascinating history of the Victorian goldfields, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you'd like to support this channel, just hit the like button and share this video.